All right. We are right at 11 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. This is very important. We have our general election coming up, and we felt like this was information that we all needed to hear. So our Tara is the financial administrator here at Silk, and she's going to be helping keep up with your questions in the chat. So if you do have a question, if you'll put it in the chat, Tara will keep track of those questions and BB will answer them at the end of the presentation. If I forgot to tell you, my name is Shelley Richardson and I'm the Executive Director of the Statewide Independent Living Council. So I want to introduce our host and speaker today. Her name is BB Novich, and I'm going to use my handy dandy assistive technology to help me read. So BB Novich is an attorney serving as the Voting Access Manager for Equip for Equality, which is the Illinois State Protection and Advocacy Service for Individuals with Disabilities. Ms. Novich began her career in the disability rights enforcement in 1992 as a trial attorney with the Disability Rights Section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, investigating and litigating cases under Titles 1, 2, and 3 of the Americans with Disability Act. From 1996 to 2005, she created and directed the United States Attorney Program for ADA Enforcement, where she supervised ADA cases being handled by the Assistant U.S. Attorneys nationwide. Following her work for the Justice Department, Ms. Novich moved to Chicago and served as the first director of ADA policy for the Chicago Public Schools, which is the third largest school district in the United States. BB has been with Equip for Equality since 2017. I'll hand it over to you, BB.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'm very excited to talk to you and try to spread some information about voting because it's so very important this year, as you know. I think Shelley introduced me perfectly, and I am the Voting Access Manager for Equip for Equality. If you see on our screen, we have a logo that my social media director came up with for this. Certainly I didn't. It's a circle with a red, white, and blue, a blue circle with red and white boundaries and some stars surrounding a ballot box, a blue ballot box, and with a ballot with a check mark going in it, and the title Disability Votes, 10 Rights and Recommendations for Making Your Vote Count. Okay, today's agenda, just briefly, I'm going to give a little introduction. I think most of you may be familiar with Equip for Equality, but a little introduction to our voting rights program. And then a brief primer on the main federal laws that protect voting rights for people with disabilities. And then a quick primer on the voting process in Illinois. Even though it's not disability specific, it's also not something that's easy to know. I know I've voted here for now 15 or 17 years that I've lived here, and I still don't really remember the steps, and it's hard to know deadlines and all that, so I thought it would be helpful to go through that. Then I'll go into the 10 rights and recommendations for making your vote count. And then I want to hold questions till the end. I'm going to make sure to save time for it. I have an alarm set so that I save time for it, but I want to make sure we get to all the basic information. I know there are a lot of Zoom polls out there, but instead of doing a poll, I kind of wanted to get more information from the folks that are on this call. So just out of my curiosity, if anybody would like to share in the chat screen and share with everybody if you can, I'm interested in your preparation for voting this year. Number one, are you registered to vote? And if you're not sure, that's totally understandable. Just say you're not sure. This also helps me prepare for other presentations, by the way. Are you registered to vote? Are you planning to vote, yes or no, or not sure? And three, if you're planning to vote, how are you planning to vote? Are you planning to vote by mail, in person during early voting, or in person in a polling place? And if you're interested in sharing why you've made any of those choices, that would be great too. And then after you do all that, later you can do questions in the chat box too, and Tara will be taking a look at these things and bringing them up. Oh, and I want Tara to take a quick look, if she will, at your answers to the why are you voting and how are you voting? Because just to see if there's anything interesting, any trends, I think it's interesting for all of us to know. So you can go ahead and start doing that now as I give the introduction. A little bit about my organization, Equip for Equality, and you can see our logo on the side of the screen. That's our green kind of stylized star that I think has kind of a Picasso-esque head at the top of it, but I'm not sure, I'm just learning. Surrounded by a circular Equip for Equality in black. We do a lot of things. I think you're familiar with what we do, but we have a very robust voting rights practice now. We have a federal statutory mandate under the Help America Vote Act to provide guidance and advocacy services for people with disabilities in voting in order to ensure the full inclusion of people with disabilities in the voting rights process, in the electoral process. We have a statewide telephone helpline on election days. We will have one on November's election day. We also now have a separate line for text help on election day, and that's just for people who are deaf or hard of hearing or who have speech impairments and who can't use our regular telephone line. It'll get you quicker help than using a relay service or sending email. And I'll put up a screen at the end of this that shows that telephone helpline, but it's on our website as well. We have a special initiative called Voting Access Chicago, which we've been working on for a few years now with the Chicago Board of Elections, in which we manage a survey program to survey all something like 1,400 polling places that the City of Chicago Board of Elections uses, and manage and make recommendations for fixes. And the idea is to ensure full access at every polling place by November 2022. And we've made a lot of progress on that recently, I'm happy to say. And we've also started working quite a bit with the Illinois State Board of Elections. We're trying to engage in some type of survey program with them as well, but that's in talks right now. And we've been working with them recently, along with people from the National Federation of the Blind, National and of Illinois, and the Illinois Council of the Blind, to ensure accessible vote by mail. And I'll talk about that more later. There are two, the two meatiest, meaty, like as in hamburger meatiest, federal laws that protect the voting rights of individuals with disabilities are the Help America Vote Act of 2002, that's HAVA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. HAVA, I don't know how old any of you are, but you may remember, HAVA was passed after the then frightening and chaotic, we thought it was frightening and chaotic then, we didn't know what was going to come. In the year 2000, in the presidential election, there was a lot of confusion about how people voted, especially in the state of Florida. And it took a long time to get it settled who was president. And the problem there was with paper ballots. A lot of the paper ballots, you signified who you voted for by punching out a hole next to the candidate's name. And there were lots of ballots where that punch wasn't complete and the ballot counters couldn't tell who people voted for. And another way it was confusing was with ballots similar to the ones that Illinois uses, where you write in, you connect an arrow or you write in which candidate you're voting for. There were writings that people couldn't understand. There were stray marks. So there was confusion about who people were voting for. So the big push right after that election was electronic voting, because it was clearer. Now you'll see, now because of election security concerns, there's some pushback against electronic voting. So it'll take some time for that to all settle out. But HAVA was passed to improve the electoral process for all US citizens, and it had some specific provisions for people with disabilities. Number one, HAVA specifies that people with disabilities must be able to vote privately and independently. And that had not been said explicitly in any previous law, not in the ADA and not in a predecessor voting rights law. called the Voting Rights for the Elderly and Handicapped Act of, I don't know, 1820 or no, it's like the 70s law, I think. So there was that important statement in HAVA. And the other important provision for people with disabilities was HAVA gave money, and still does, and thus requires each polling place to have at least one electronic voting machine. And that helps people with disabilities because those provide accessibility in polling places for people who are blind or low vision, or who have limited manual dexterity and can't use writing implements to write out paper ballots. So HAVA did a lot to help the accessibility and independence of the voting rights. Then the Americans with Disabilities Act, which predated HAVA by 12 years, also covers voting, but it's not specific to voting. Title II of the ADA covers everything state municipal governments do. So it requires the people with disabilities have access to all state and local government programs and activities, including voting. But because it was meant to cover so many activities, there's nothing specific to voting in there, even though its concepts apply to voting. So as I said, it covers everything state and local government entities do, including county clerks and boards of elections. And among those things that it requires of them is it mandates that polling places comply with ADA architectural requirements and ADA requirements for program access. And it requires equally effective communication between electoral authorities and voters with disabilities. So together, these two laws require that people with disabilities are afforded accessible voting, independent voting, and private voting. So here's a quick primer on the voting process in Illinois, the steps that a voter has to go through to vote, and the choices a voter can make. In the top diagram are the two steps any voter has to follow to vote in Illinois. It's two rectangles connected by a plus sign to denote that you have to do both steps. Step one is register to vote, or if you're already registered, confirm that you're registered. And step two is vote. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of those steps in a little while. But we have, as of right now, we have three choices on how to vote. And that is denoted in the bottom diagram by three sort of ovals, sort of circles, three circles that are connected by two smaller circles that say or. So you can choose to, the leftmost circle, vote by mail, the middle circle, vote in person, but during early voting, and the rightmost circle, vote in person on election day. Those are your choices, and we'll talk about each of those too. And I want to let you know, the governor signed emergency legislation in June, May or June, and it's emergency legislation that's only going to be applicable through this November's election. It automatically repeals on January 1st, 2021, but it's for COVID-19 reasons. Because of concerns of COVID, the legislature and the governor wanted to give many more opportunities to vote so that we have fewer people, we have more polling places and thus fewer people in polling places at one time so people can socially distance and can vote safely. So what they did was, if you see at the bottom of the screen, they expanded vote by mail procedures and early voting. And they declared a state holiday on election day. So all government buildings and schools are closed on election day. And that opens up way more polling places for election boards to use. And it also means that employees won't, and people who normally, customers and whatever, who normally use those buildings won't have to be there that day. So lots of social distancing. But these are only for this election. If, I don't know if there's gonna be a movement after this election to make any of these permanent, but these are definitely true for this election. Okay, a little bit more about the voting process in Illinois. And this is really the voting process in the US. One thing that I feel sad that I've had to learn this, but I realize it's not intuitive, is the voting process is very much a patchwork across the US. The federal government doesn't set very many voting rules or laws. Most of it is done at the state level. So each state can, within some limits, come up with its own requirements for voting, its own procedures for voting, and its deadlines. And the state, at least in Illinois, sets some minimums and some requirements, but by and large, voting procedures and rules are set at the local level by the 108 counties and election authorities across the state. So that's why it's such a patchwork, and it's not always easy to know deadlines for everything and how you can vote, because you have to check with your local election authority. So as I was saying, you can get some information from the Illinois State Board of Elections. They actually have a very informative website, and I'll give you the address. But your local election authority is often the best source to contact for questions and information about how you need to register and vote. And that goes for anybody voting, but especially if you have a disability and you need some type of accommodation. And you see at the bottom of the screen, I will talk about your local election authority, or your LEA, a lot. Usually that means it's your county clerk. Across the state, most local election authorities are county clerks, but there are some, like Chicago, that have a separate election authority set for the city versus the county. That's true in Bloomington and Galesburg and East St. Louis, a few other places like that. We have a City of Chicago Board of Elections as separate from the Cook County, the suburban Cook County Board of Elections. And that's actually the Cook County clerk is the local election authority. So to find out who your local election authority is, go to the Illinois State Board of Elections website, and that's elections, www.elections.il, and that's elections plural, .il.gov. Oh, so I want to check in now and see if Tara saw anything interesting in the chat about how people are planning on voting and all that.
Hi, baby. This is Tara. I don't see any questions so far in the chat box.
Did anybody share their plans?
Yes.
For voting?
Yes, I had 4 people voting by mail. There was 6 people who have plan on or already have dropped their ballot into the secure drop boxes.
Fantastic.
And 3 people going to vote in person. One's going to take advantage of early voting, they indicated.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, and I can't see the right side of my screen because of the little screens, but to describe what's on this slide, on the right side of the screen, I have an outline of actually a blue color picture of the state of Illinois with Springfield, the star where Springfield is, and that's to denote things that are rules and deadlines that are set at the state level. But then underneath it, there's another picture of Illinois with each of the 108 counties, or it's not 108 counties, but 108 individual election authorities done in different colors to show you how many different decision makers there are in this process. Okay, so let's go right into the 10 rights and recommendations for making your vote count. And I want to call your attention to the graphic we have on the side of the screen, on the right side of the screen. This is done by a Chicago artist named Dean Strauss, and it was commissioned by the National Disability Rights Network, which is Equip for Equality's national network. And I loved his art, so he just did this stuff. So it shows 3 people above a banner that says voting is power. And on the left, you have what looks like a woman with gray hair and a blue scarf holding up what looks like a mail ballot. And in the middle, there is what looks like an African-American man sitting in a wheelchair with a trach tube, and he's holding a poster that says voting is power. And on the right, there is what looks like a woman with long hair and glasses, and she's holding up what looks to be a ballot that she's checked off. So voting is power, and votingwithdisabilities.org is on the drawing as well. So I think that's where you can go to find out more information about this. Let's talk about registration. Because your number 1 right is you have the right to accept voter registration. In Illinois, here are the basic registration rules. On the left, there's a rectangle that points out that you must register to vote if you've never registered before in Illinois, you've moved, or you've changed your name. And you can check to see if you're registered on that Illinois State Board of Elections website, elections.il.gov, under voter registration information. Very helpful. In the center, the deadlines are outlined. The deadlines for registration. You can register online, but only up until October 18th at 11:59 p.m. You can also register in person as of now, any day now. And in person, you can register up to and including on Election Day in Illinois, which is a great thing. If you do it before Election Day in person, you can register in a lot of different places, your county clerk's office, Secretary of State's office, and any early voting location. On Election Day, you have to do it, for the most part, at your precinct's polling place, your assigned polling place. There may be some variance among the different local election authorities, but that's a basic. The ID to bring is 2 forms. This is for registering, not voting. 2 forms, including one that shows your current address. And there's a lot of complication to the ID requirement, which I don't really have time to talk about now, but if there are specific questions, we can talk about them later. On the bottom of the screen, I just wanted to point out, if your registration is challenged when you vote in person, you can vote a provisional ballot. So this is if you go early voting or on voting day to vote in person, but you want to register at the same time. But there's something wrong with your registration. Either your signature doesn't match a signature they had on file, or someone challenges for whatever reason. You can vote a provisional ballot. Provisional ballots are ballots that are, you fill out your ballot, you put it in a certification envelope, you sign the certification envelope and seal it, and then they go in a separate place so that between whenever that happens and 10 days after Election Day, if you can resolve whatever issue it was, your vote will be counted. And I put on the right, and this is the most important thing you can learn from today's lecture, if anything, register well in advance, because you want to anticipate any potential problems that are going to arise and have time to resolve them. So register. If you haven't done it, do it today. So now, what's accessible? Your right to accessible voter registration includes things like an accessible registration website. If you can register online, the local election authority, the state election authority have to make that accessible for people who have print disabilities. So registration forms and the website itself have to be accessible to people with print disabilities. And that's people who are blind, low vision, and have limited manual dexterity, and possibly some learning disabilities. Another right to accessibility in the registration process is they have to provide reasonable modifications of policies for people with disabilities who can't obtain typical IDs needed to prove citizenship and residency. So for instance, Barry Taylor and my vice president and I helped somebody who who's living in a CILA, a community integrated living arrangement, and didn't have any proof of address because he doesn't own or rent and doesn't get utility forms or anything else that would prove your residence. So we had the person who, a caregiver from the CILA, filled out, we came up with an affidavit for her to submit attesting to the fact that he's been living at that place for at least 30 days. I'm trying to find out if it worked. You have to submit it, she had to submit it to the state, but election authorities do have to make reasonable modifications in their typical policies so that people with disabilities can register. Number 2, you have a right to accessible vote by mail. Vote by mail has been expanded and it's booming in these COVID days. But let's talk a little bit about how it works in general. I meant to bring something in. All right. Vote by mail, and I think I have a little mailbox icon on the top right of the screen. I'm not sure if it's there yet. No, not yet. Vote by mail in Illinois and recent state legislation strongly encourages vote by mail because of COVID-19. It's a 2-step process. Well, it's a little bit more than 2 steps, but you have to apply to vote by mail. You have to be a registered voter and then apply. Now, if you are registering to vote now for the first time or because you've moved or something, you will automatically get an application to vote by mail. That's part of the new state statute. But assuming you've already been registered and you're not going to be doing that part of the process, you need to affirmatively apply to vote by mail with your local election authority or the State Board of Elections. They have a place to do it on their website, but all they're going to do is forward it to your local election authority. When you apply, you'll receive an official ballot in the mail from your local election authority. It's supposed to happen within a certain amount of days, very few days, so it should happen quickly. You'll get that, you complete your ballot, say who you're going to vote for, and I have a little ballot that I was showing to people. What you'll get in the mail is an envelope that has instructions on how to vote by mail and how to fill out your ballot and submit it. It also has a list of all the drop boxes and places you can submit your ballot if you don't want to send it in the US mail. It has the ballot itself, so you fill that out. And it also has a return envelope, which they call the certification envelope. That's the important thing, because what you have to do is put that ballot in your certification envelope and sign the certification envelope. It shows you where to do that on the envelope itself. You'll send that in, or you'll drop it off in a Dropbox. And I think I go to the next slide. Yeah. So you'll send your completed ballot in the sealed envelope back to your local election authority, either using US mail or a Dropbox. And there's a list of Dropboxes on your local election authority's website, and it should be in the information you get sent to you with your ballot by mail. You can't FedEx it. It's got to be mail or Dropbox. Then 3 election judges are going to look at the signature on the outside of that, the certification envelope to validate your ballot. That's how they validate. That's how all voting ID is kind of validated in Illinois. It's done purely by signature, matching signatures on your certification envelope or when you go in the polling place to sign. They match your signature. So they're going to match your signature. And if all 3 judges decide that it's not a valid signature, they will invalidate it and they'll notify you within 2 days. You can submit a statement saying that it's your signature, so reaffirming it, and then they'll count it. But so there's a little bit of time that has to elapse here, or that may have to elapse. Signatures are by statute presumed to be valid unless all 3 judges agree, and the judges have to be 2 have to be from different parties. So you'll send in your ballot in your certified envelope. Hopefully no problems. They don't count it till election day, but hopefully you'll get it in as soon as possible because of all these possible things that can happen. And that's how vote by mail works. Now the question that has come up repeatedly is at the bottom of the screen, can I change my mind and vote in person even though I've applied for and received my ballot? The answer is yes, you absolutely can. If you want to do that, bring the ballot you received in the mail to wherever you want to vote in person, your early voting or your election day voting polling place, and tell them you received this, but you want to vote in person, and they will mark it as a spoiled ballot and it will not be counted. So no problem with that. Just make sure to bring it with you. If you never got it, you should let them know. There are places online with your local election authority that you can check what happened. That actually, I think it's been excellent how it's worked in Chicago. They confirm that they got your application. They tell you when they're going to send you your vote by mail ballot. There's by statute, they're supposed to check with you if you haven't sent in your ballot twice. So there's a lot of fail-safes in here. Now, for accessible vote by mail, it's a little trickier, of course. For people with print disabilities, sending a hard copy through the US mail is not very accessible. But you do have a right to your vote by mail application website, and forms have to be accessible. They should be available in accessible formats. And ballots have to be provided in accessible formats too. That is your right under the ADA. And luckily, there is a new state accessible vote by mail program. It's pretty new. It was just announced maybe a month ago. And the state has contracted with a company to provide electronic ballots that can be emailed to the voter and downloaded by the voter, completed electronically using screen reader or whatever assistive technology you have. Then you have to print it out, sign it, sign the certification envelope, and send it back by regular mail. So it's not perfectly accessible, but it's still way better than we've had in the past. So, so the state board contracted with the company to do this, but it's not mandatory for local election authorities. So they have to sign on to get this program, even though it's free for them, but they have to affirmatively sign on, and the state board has asked them to. But I want to tell you that many have not. Only about 40 of the 108 authorities have signed on. Some, like Chicago, is already had their own system in place, so they're not using the state's program. But there are others that may not have this at all. And if this is something you want, and you live in one of the counties that isn't signing up for this, I would call your local election authority and encourage them to sign on to this program, because it is free for them. But their absolute drop dead date for the local election authority's drop dead date for signing up for this program is next Monday. So it's got to be fast. You don't have to apply to vote by mail by next Monday. The deadline is later in October, but I would encourage you, if you want to do this, apply very soon, because you just don't want to take a chance on deadlines getting lost. Number 3, right. You have a right to an accessible polling place if you're going to vote in person, and that's during early voting or on election day. Let's talk a little bit about early voting. Early voting is it's voting in a polling place prior to election day. Usually election authorities choose a subset of locations that they're going to use for early voting. And it's different numbers depending on the election authority. Typically for early voting, anyone can vote in any early voting location within their local election district. So you don't have to go to one for your particular precinct. So I could go to any voting location in Chicago, any early voting location. There are 50, they have one per ward. I don't have to go to the one in my ward. And that's true throughout the state, but different election authorities have different amounts of early voting locations. I know that the suburban Cook County has like 52 locations. Sangamon County, where Springfield is, only had 2 locations, but they probably didn't need as much. So those are what the early voting locations are. You can find out about your early voting location either by calling your election authority, your local authority, or there's a list of them on the elections.il.gov website. Early voting has already begun in many counties throughout the state. In Chicago, one site opened, the rest of them are all opening on the 14th. The times and hours of days and hours of operation are going to differ depending on your locality and depending on the particular site. So check carefully before you go. You definitely don't want to go when it's not open. On to election day voting. That happens on Tuesday, November 3rd. Oh, and I'm sorry. Early voting is in place everywhere from October 14th through the day before election day. So you have lots of opportunities to do it, and I highly recommend it. It's like low stress voting. Not that many people are there. You don't have to stand in lines for the most part. It's really a good time to vote. Election day voting is on Tuesday, November 3rd, 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. On election day, you have to vote at the precinct polling place to which you are assigned for the most part. And you can find out which one you're assigned to if you haven't gotten notice in the mail at elections.il.gov. So if you're going to vote in person, as I said, number 3, you have a right to an accessible polling place. And that means for people with physical disabilities, accessible parking, there are 4 black and white drawings on this slide. The one on the top left shows accessible parking. It's a woman in a wheelchair coming out of a van being deployed on a lift into an access aisle. Across the access aisle is a man coming out of a sedan in his walker into the access aisle. So you're entitled to accessible parking at a polling place if they offer parking to voters, which in Chicago they don't many times. But if there's parking for voters, there has to be accessible parking for voters. On the right top, that polling place has to have an accessible voter entrance. And there's a black and white drawing showing an elementary school, Ridgemont Elementary School. And it highlights the exterior routes and a person in a wheelchair going through an at-grade door entrance to the polling place. Then on the bottom left, It shows, oh, I gotta move. Okay. I will move quickly. On the bottom left, you're entitled to accessible routes to that polling place and through that polling place. So exterior routes from public transit, on sidewalks, from parking, and from any passenger drop-offs they have, and through the polling place, through whatever hallways you have to go to, getting into the voting room, through the voting room, from the registration desk to the polling stations. And the black and white drawing shows highlights of all the, like a cross section of a polling place with the roof cut off, and all the highlights of those routes from transportation, parking, drop-offs, excuse me, to the into the voting room and to the voting room, excuse me. And finally, you have a right to, excuse me again. Sorry about that. You have a right to an accessible voting booth in the voting room. And this drawing shows a wheelchair accessible voting booth with a person, a woman in a wheelchair at the voting booth, and the clear floor space that's required at the voting booth. Now let's talk about wheelchair accessible voting booths a little bit, because your number 4 right is the right to accessible voting booths and machines. So wheelchair accessible voting booth typically has to have a lowered writing surface, extra knee width, so that somebody in a wheelchair can get under the writing surface to write on it, and 5-foot turning space, usually, which is necessary to turn around and get under that booth. And the photos I have on this slide, the one on the left shows, this is how Chicago Board of Elections did accessible voting booths up till now. And it shows a lowered voting booth with an arrow showing that the surface can be no more than 34 inches high, the writing surface. The knee space has to be at least 30 inches minimum wide and at least 27 inches high. And the way Chicago does it, and I outlined this in the photo, is they put little black extenders on the legs of the voting booth, which allow you to extend the width of those legs as much as you need to, so that there's enough wheelchair knee space to get under it. On the right, it shows the 5-foot circle of turning space that's necessary to get under that voting machine. And that's not always necessary if they're not crowded. You may not need a full 5 feet, but in the past, they've been so crowded that you've always needed full 5 feet to get under that voting station. Another type of accessible voting station is accessible voting machines, the electronic voting machine, not so that it's accessible to people who are blind, low vision, or who have other print disabilities. As I said before, these are required by HAVA, and they're required by ADA too, as a method of voting access and effective communication, although the ADA, like I said, it doesn't specify things that are unique to voting, like it doesn't say you have to have an electronic voting machine, but it says you have to have effective communication. And there are 2 pictures on this slide. The left is a black and white drawing of 2 people at voting stations. One person is a person without a physical disability standing at a voting station that's high. And then next to that person is a man in a motorized wheelchair with a service animal who's sitting at a wheelchair accessible lowered station and who's using a pointing implement to choose people on the electronic ballot. And then on the right, this is a shot of the electronic voting machines that the city of Chicago was using last year. So it just shows they were all at wheelchair accessible voting stations in early voting. This is just in early voting, that they had them at every station. And that's what it looks like. It's just a machine that they put on a table, and sometimes there's a printer attached to it. Number 5, you have a right to vote curbside. And this is a tricky one. Curbside voting is usually, in the past, at least in the advocacy community of people with disabilities, has been disfavored as a method of providing access because it's not integrated. And it can't generally be a substitute for making a polling place accessible. Excuse me for just a sec. There's been over-reliance on it in the past instead of making polling places accessible, at least countrywide, and it's been improperly implemented. But this year, I wouldn't disfavor it as much because of COVID. I think it's very important to people who don't want to go into polling places or feel that they're too at risk to do that. So, and it's encouraged, although not explicitly required in that state emergency legislation. So local election authorities should be providing this. I think you arguably have a right to it under the ADA this year because of COVID, but it's not something that's really well known out there. So if you need it, I would arrange for it in advance. And how it works is you walk, roll, or drive up to a location near the voter entrance, notify the election judges that you need this. That's the tricky part, because how do you do that? That's why I'm saying do it in advance, because I think most election authorities will not have a way to do that when you just show up. 2 election judges, 1 from each party, bring you the voting machine or the voting surface and the ballots and privacy screen so you can vote privately. Then you fill it out, then they put it in privacy sheets and they bring it back into the polling place and they put it in the ballot box. So it's out there, you have a right to it, but I wouldn't assume it's going to be provided for you unless you arrange for it in advance. Number 6, you have the right to assistance and effective communication. You have the right to assistance with voting if you request it, not as a substitute for providing independent access. I don't think any election authority can rely on that as their method of access, but if you need that for your disability, you have a right to it. The only thing it can't be provided by your employer or your union leader, that's according to statute, and you'll need to sign an affidavit attesting to your approval of the assistance, and usually the assistant has to also, the person assisting you has to fill out an affidavit about it. You have a right to alternative formats of printed materials, including an electronic ballot. You have a right to auxiliary aids and services, including writing notes back and forth if you, for instance, are deaf or hard of hearing, writing notes back and forth with an election judge, and sign language interpretation. But again, you're going to have to think about arranging for that decent amount of time in advance because election authorities don't have them posted and waiting to help. And then on the right, we have another piece of art by that same artist, Dean Strauss, called Know Your Rights. And it's the same thing about assistance for voting. If you need someone to assist you vote, you have, and I can't see it right now, you have the right to have a family member or someone you trust help you, but it can't be your employer or union representative. Number 7, you have a right to properly trained polling place workers. They need to be trained to allow reasonable modifications of policies, like that they have to allow service animals. They need to know that they have to help someone fill out their ballot or use a voting machine if necessary. And they don't have to tell you how to vote. That they shouldn't do. But if you need assistance filling out the ballot at your direction, they are supposed to do that. They need to be trained to provide effective communication with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And they need to be trained to properly provide curbside voting. And there's a picture on a photo on the side of this screen of a woman sitting at a desk that says official voting site, and behind her is a blackboard that says thanks for voting. You have a right to them being trained properly. That being said, this is not a typical year. There are tons of new election judges because lots of other election judges from the past have dropped out. A lot of them are older people who felt too at risk for COVID. So there are going to be a lot of new people there, which may be a great thing, but they may not be familiar with how things work. So don't take anything for granted. Arrange in advance. Number 8, you have the right to file a complaint if you have problems with voting. You can file a complaint under HAVA with the State Board of Elections. That process has a lot of administrative requirements. It has to be filed, for instance, within 90 days of the occurrence. Your complaint has to be in writing. It has to be sworn before a notary. You have to serve a copy on the election authority. There's a full list of the administrative requirements at this link that I put in the PowerPoint, which if anyone needs me to send out this PowerPoint afterwards, I'd be happy to. If you need help filing a complaint under HAVA, you can call Equip for Equality and we'll help you. You can also file a complaint, an ADA complaint with the US Department of Justice at the link that I provided, and they will take complaints online or in writing. You can also contact Equip for Equality to help you. with our main phone line, or you can contact me directly. We aren't an administrative agency, so we don't have official power to investigate complaints, but we can try to help you achieve a resolution. But number 9, and this slide is, this and the next slide are really the most important things to learn. My recommendation is research everything in advance. This is not a typical year. Don't just hope for the best and rely on filing a complaint after the fact, because that means your vote probably doesn't count. Make sure you're registered in the correct precinct before. Check on the website, elections.il.gov. Find out what your polling place is. Find out about whatever accessibility you need there. Ask specific questions. Call your local election authority and ask. Or find out about how to vote by mail by contacting your local election authority, and make sure you know the local deadlines and the local procedures. If you need accessible vote by mail, call them and find out if they're doing it. Get information about any accommodations you may need and any advance requirements for obtaining them. I gave you some resources there. Call your county clerk or your city county board of elections for this information. You can look find a list of those if you don't know what your local election authority is at that same website that I keep talking about under information for voters. And then finally, and then you can also contact the State Board of Elections with any questions. Their ADA coordinator, Ms. Jordan Homer, is wonderful and really knows a lot of stuff. And her phone number is 217-782-4003 or jhomer, Homer, at elections.il.gov. And then number 10, my strong recommendation is whatever you need to do to find out to feel comfortable with that you're going to be able to vote the way you want and your vote's going to count immediately, do it now, right after this webinar. When I saw Michelle Obama speak her speech at the Democratic National Convention, and she ended it with something that really made me jump up and get into action. She said, if you haven't registered to vote or applied to vote by mail, do it now. Do it tonight. And that's what I did. I did it that night. And I hope you will do all of that today, right after this webinar, because this is just a weird year. There are lots of new people involved. There are lots of new procedures involved, new equipment, new things, lots of disinformation and insecurity out there about what's going on. So get on it immediately. And you won't regret it. Your vote will definitely count. And that's what this is all about. And Equip for Equality this is our telephone helpline information that I said I would provide. I will send out this PowerPoint, but this will be on our website. Our voice telephone is 800-537-2632. We have a TTY number, 800-610-2779. We have a text line on election day only. And this is only for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or who have speech impairments and can't use our telephone voice line. And the text line is 312-826-0049. You can email us at voting@equipforequality.org. And this is all available election day only, 6 a.m. to 7 p.m., November 3rd. And with that, I just want to talk about questions, but let me just describe the last piece of art we have, which is by that same artist, Dean Strauss. And it is a picture of what looks like an African-American woman with long, dark hair. Actually, you can't tell. The long, dark hair and a pink dress. And she's standing at a voting station, and she's got a service animal next to her, and her cane is leaning on the voting station. And above her, there's a banner, red, white, and blue banner. And this is all about, get out there and vote, or get home and vote. Whatever you do it now. And let me know any questions you have. Put them in the chat, and Tara will read them out.
I do have 6 questions. Shelley, did you want to make any announcements real quick?
I just want to say that if you have a problem on the day that you're trying to vote, it's very important that you report that problem. If you don't report the problem and you don't follow through, then others that come behind you are going to have the same issues. So this is our time for advocacy. Be an advocate, step up, do what you can to change the system for the better.
That's a great point, Shelley. Thank you.
Okay, this is Tara. Reba, number one, the first question was, can a person who has a guardian vote?
The answer is generally yes, but unless in Illinois, and this is, every state can be different, but in Illinois, if you're under a guardianship alone doesn't prevent voting. If there's something specific in the guardianship about voting that says you can't vote, then you can't. That's pretty rare, I would think. And if there's something in your guardianship about that and you think it shouldn't be there, contact us right away. But guardianships per se do not prevent you to be eligible to vote.
Thank you. And the second question, what happens if you forget to bring your spoiled ballot when you vote in person?
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask that. I think you can still vote. I think you can still vote in person as long as that other ballot doesn't show up with a vote. So I would destroy it. If you forget to bring it, I would destroy it. But, let me check on that, because it may be that it's best for you to send it in afterwards for them to spoil it. So let me check, and I can get information afterwards.
Which kind of leads to the third question, which is similar. What if I threw away my mail-in ballot because I knew I was going to vote in person? Can I get another one? What if I messed up on my ballot?
Let me answer. I'm going to answer that at the same time. I believe you can fill out an affidavit that says what happened to it, but let me do that a little. Let me come up with a more complete answer, and I'll send it. Should I send it to you, to Shelley and Tara?
Yes, please. I do have everybody who registered for this webinar's email addresses, so I can send out your PowerPoint and I can send out any answers to these questions.
Great.
After. Okay. And then the next question, what happens if my signature changes due to my disability progression?
Good question. In Chicago, and I think you can probably do this statewide, but definitely in Chicago, if you're a Chicago voter, they have a signature update form that's specifically for this purpose. And I can send out a link to that because, that's true of a lot of people. So I will also send a link to that, and I'll check and see if that's available in other places. You may want to check with your local election authority about that issue, because that's the best place to get your up-to-date information about whether they use a similar form.
And the next question is the accessible ballot program just for this year, or did it just start this year?
It just started a month ago. I don't know that there's any discussion yet of whether it's going to go forward. I would like to see, I have to say, as of about a week ago, there were almost no people signed up for it. So I'd like to see a little bit more demand for it out there. I know there are good, legitimate reasons to have some doubts in it since it's kind of last minute, but I would like to see more, at least, testing of the system this year. And hopefully, I certainly will be one of the ones pushing for it to go on.
And that was all the questions in the chat room. I wonder if I should unmute everybody very briefly. We have about 5 minutes until noon.
Sure.
And see if there's anyone who wasn't able to type in the chat room has any questions.
Yeah, can people raise their hands on Zoom? I can't remember.
We don't have access to this with our program.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so if you have any questions, if you're going to unmute everyone, just say your name and before your question.
Hi, this is Nafia. Bibi, it's nice to see you again. Thank you so much for leading this presentation, and thank you, Silk, for leading this, as well as everybody that's on this webinar. It's great to see a lot of my colleagues and friends on here. Thanks so much. One question I had is, do you have any idea if there's any reasonable accommodations that are available in Illinois as it relates to different formats? Like, for instance, I know that we have things like voting machines that, like, for instance, can talk to you, that like read off of, different names of candidates. But do you know if somebody has like an intellectual disability that maybe the support is different that's needed. Like, for instance, having somebody maybe use like a picture format or some sort of other like accommodation that can be done to like make sure that somebody with an IDD, for instance, can vote. I mean, I think that that's also something that I've noticed that Illinois may not be like, as far as other states, potentially like behind, you know, they're maybe behind on. So I didn't know, like, do you know of anything like that in Illinois as far as like providing that support for people with IDD that may not have the same support needs as somebody, for instance, with, you know, that may be deaf or blind or maybe needs different accommodations? I was just curious about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the first thing that you were talking about, like doing anything for audio ballots besides just reading the information that's on there. It's possible that if you call to ask for it in advance, that somebody can arrange for it. As far as other accommodations, like somebody who's deaf or blind or deaf-blind, I know that in Chicago they have provided interpreters for someone who's deaf-blind, specific to them. And I would argue that they have a requirement to do that elsewhere. That's just the one instance that I know about.
Thank you so much, baby, and I'll definitely reach out to the local elected official, like the supervisor of elections for some of these other counties, so I can share that with advocates. Thank you so much again for doing this presentation, for your time.
Good questions. Other questions?
Yes, Phoebe, this is Tara again. A follow-up to the signature and the disability progression. What if the disability has progressed to the state where you cannot sign your name at all?
I think that's the same thing. I believe you can have a stamp, but you have to have an affidavit. But let me answer that in writing after this.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Because I know that people, we've been talking about that with regard to the remote electronic ballot, because you still have to sign the envelope manually. So I'll find out and email that. Anything else that I can't answer today? Because I love questions that I don't know the answer to. Actually, they're embarrassing because I should know the answers, but they're very good for me because I will find out the answers and I'll know them next time. So I appreciate your asking them.
So if I had a vote by mail ballot and I messed it up, I didn't do it right, can I request another one?
I don't think you can request another one through the mail.
I would have to go
in person.
In person.
Yeah, and you can get those ballots in person by going to your local election authority.
Yeah. Yeah, I was looking at the contents, and you think it would be, you know, really easy to do, but you have to read and follow those directions in order to do this properly, because if it's not done properly, they will not accept it.
That's right. I mean, the really important part of it is the signature, but you're right. I mean, the ballot has to be filled out in a way that can be read, because it's ultimately going to be read. It's going to be transformed into a regular paper ballot and read by the machines. So it's got to be read by somebody or something.
Yeah. Anybody have any final questions? All right, well, hearing none, I want to again thank BB for her time today and her presentation. Thank everybody for attending, and Tara will get the PowerPoint sent out along with BB's answers to some of the questions that she's going to research.
I'll get them done either by the end of today or early tomorrow.
All right. All right, all thank